All right, here we go. Next step, 14. Temporarily assemble pistons to connecting rods. Even if you're performing a stock rebuild, you will need to assemble at least 2 pistons to their respective connecting rods at this time. See piston and connecting rod orientation rules on page 113 before proceeding with this step or subsequent steps that involve installation of pistons and connecting rods. For high performance engines using aftermarket rods and longer throw cranks, which I am, you will now want to assemble all pistons to their respective rods. Note, for floating piston pins, lightly lubricate the friction surfaces, but do not install the spiral locks or other pin retaining clips at this time. Just be careful the pin does not slide too far out of the side of the piston at any time. As to pressed piston pins, if you haven't had your machine shop install them already, for fear of possible additional piston machining being required, you can assemble your pistons to your rods temporarily by borrowing a ground down pin from your machine shop or by purchasing a special dummy pin of the correct diameter. All right, so we need to go ahead to page 113. And 113 says, piston and connecting rod orientation rules. Determining proper piston and connecting rod orientation on the Gen 4 and 3 and 4 is critical because of factors like the offset pin design of factory and many aftermarket pistons and the fillet journals of many aftermarket cranks. To ensure that you assemble your pistons to your rods and subsequently install them into the engine correctly, take note of below orientation rules. In the case of pressed piston pins, these rules will also help you verify your machine shop assembled your pistons to your rods correctly. Inspect the face of your pistons for an imprinted arrow. All right, so first things first, I need to clean up this mess. I mean, look at this. So I need to clear out this whole table so I can do this properly. All right, so I'm going to take a break and I'm going to get this all cleaned up and I will be right back. And it says, inspect the face of, well, first of all, I think what we're going to do here is pull out all the pistons. Let me get something to put these on. So that I'm not just laying them. All right. These are the Summit Pro LS pistons. All right, it says, inspect the face of your pistons for an imprinted arrow. Without exception, this arrow must point toward the front of the engine. Let's see an arrow. Similarly, some pistons are manufactured with a small mark toward one side of the pin. This mark denotes the side of the pin that must face the front of the engine. Sometimes there is a small chunk of material on the underside of the piston or on or near the pin bore that serves the same purpose, but rarely will this be your only indicator. Additionally, if your pistons have 2 side-by-side valve reliefs, like here, note that they must face the top of the engine, i.e. be installed towards the intake manifold. Those with pistons having 4 valve reliefs or 1 valve relief on either side of the piston pin center line don't have to worry about this last point. So I'm going to take a guess that this is probably the orientation that this is going to have to happen. All right. This being the front of the engine. It looks like these valve reliefs here, the bigger ones, are towards the front. And then on 2 through 8, the bigger ones are towards the back. All right. So I'm feeling pretty good about this. Generation 4 engines. Look at the area where the rod cap meets the rest of the rod. Near these mating surfaces, you will see a wider tab on one side of the rod than the other. All right, let's get the rods out. Okay. So I don't think these are marked. Look at the area where the rod cap meets the rest of the rod. Okay, here and here. Near these mating surfaces, you will see a wider tab on one side of the rod than the other. Okay, I would assume that this is the wider side. It is this wider tab that faces the front of the engine. Some Gen 4 rods use a tab on one side and none on the other. In this case, the tab side faces forward. I honestly do not know. They look pretty much the same to me. Aftermarket rods. When using aftermarket connecting rods, as with aftermarket pistons, always follow the orientation instructions supplied by the manufacturer. As a general rule, aftermarket connecting rods have a bearing bore shape designed to match up with the large radius fillets of most aftermarket crankshafts. Oh, this is interesting. Okay. So it says here, a close inspection of a typical aftermarket LS rod reveals that the two sides of the bearing bore are not the same. One is more heavily chamfered, and see how this one's got this little chamfer right here, and this side does not. And it is this side of the rod that must normally face the crank journal fillet, i.e. toward the intake valve side of that cylinder. Please note that many GM rods appear to have the same difference in bearing bore chamfer side to side. Ignore this in the case of factory rods. So this is the impact. So on this cylinder, this is the intake side. So this chamfered side would go kind of like so. All right. So that helps me tremendously. All right. And then on this side, you have the chamfered side on this side. So it looks like the chamfered side is always on the side without the label. So the side without the label goes towards the intake valve. All right, so we'll remember that. All right, that was actually pretty helpful. Very good. All right, so back to step 14. I'm going to read this again. Even if you're performing a stock rebuild, you will need to assemble at least 2 pistons to their respective connecting rods at this time. See piston connecting rod orientation rules on page 113 before proceeding with this step or subsequent steps that involve installation of pistons and connecting rods. For high performance engine using aftermarket rods and longer throw cranks, you will now want to assemble all pistons to their respective rods. Note, for floating piston pins, Lightly lubricate the friction surfaces, but do not install the spiral locks. All right, so I'm just reading ahead to step 15, and what we're going to do here with step 15 is checking rod bearing clearances. Adjust crankshaft and lock from turning. What we're going to do here is measure rod bearing clearances. Measuring rod bearing clearances is a little more involved than checking those of the main bearings because of the need to prevent the crank from spinning in the block and the rod from spinning on the journal, lest plastic gauge become damaged. The only truly reliable way to do this is to install your flywheel onto the back of the crank and use a flywheel holding tool to lock the crankshaft from turning. Before doing this though, get the crank journal you will be using to lowest point of travel in the block. This will be near as possible to a bottom dead center for both pistons that share that rod journal. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a break and I'm going to do some research on the Summit website about installing these or putting these together. Okay, so I want to make sure I get this right. I want to make sure that what I've read so far makes sense. I want to make sure that, you know, that I'm putting these pistons together, I'm doing it the right way. And fortunately, the Summit webpage has basically instruction manuals for everything you buy on there, pretty much. So I'm going to go do some research, maybe check some videos out, and then I'm going to install these, or at least put them together, that is, before I move on to step 15, which is, oh, and then the other thing I need to do is, yeah, I need to do something about this here flywheel thing, flex plate. The flex plate that I bought, I'm not too crazy about, so I might return it and get the better one, the higher performance one. And I need to be able to lock down the crank, which I have the tool for that. I have this locking device here, but I don't think I want to put the flex plate on just yet because it's not the one that I'm going to ultimately use. So anyway, I'm going to do some research. I'm going to put these together. I'll try to record as much of that as possible, and then I will be right back.